Start at any time.
Yes, that is true. So we're really happy to have Joseph here today. He's the CEO of StartX. And as some of you may know, Verdigris had its early days with this, would you call it an incubator?
It's a founder community because we continue to support companies all the way through to IPO. But they were definitely at the accelerator incubator stage when Mark and team first showed up at StartX.
Right, but he's really in a good position to give us a talk and to talk to us about a couple of issues that we might be facing today, because he also had his own startup right out of school. So he graduated with a master's from Stanford and then started a startup called Wi-Fi Slam, is that right? Which sold several years later to Apple, and then he was there for a few years. So I think he's really seen the transition from having a really small team, a small company, and becoming a much bigger one and managing a much bigger group of people. And just, as we can tell, he's a great personality. This is the first time that I've met him, but I've watched a lot of his trainings and things, and can really tell that, he's a really cool guy. So maybe I can first ask you to give you a little of your background, like just maybe going into a bit more in depth into some of the things that you've done and sort of how you got where you are today.
Great. So we want to keep this interactive. I'm going to try to seed this with ideas that might be able to generate questions from the audience here. The way to think about useful things to talk about today are that prior to going to Stanford, we worked in the self-driving car lab at Stanford with my graduate degree, but prior to that, I was employee number 3, employee number 7, employee number 15 at a variety of startups. I had also worked at AMD, Altera, and Google. So I worked at giant companies, I worked at tiny companies. We ended up starting a company when we graduated from Stanford. We ended up selling that to Apple. And along the course of that transition, not only was I able to contrast the success, what makes giant companies successful and what makes small companies successful, but in that acquisition, I also got to go from working in basically the smallest company in the world to the largest company in the world, but we worked on the exact same thing the whole time. And so there's some really interesting things that stand out, because when you're in an early startup at about this size or smaller, little things like hiring are totally different than when you're hiring at a big company like Apple or Google. Right, when you bring people in here, you want to be interviewing them, you want to find people who fit with your mission, you want to find out like, hey, is this person really believing what we're going to do and want to try to have impact? Whereas at Apple or Google, when you're hiring, you'd get like 300 resumes a day, and you're just like trying as fast as you can to filter through them. There's an unlimited number of people that want to work at Apple, so it's a search exercise rather than a fit exercise, although you're evaluating them as well. But then the flip side is also true. Some things are completely the same. So there are things that we talk about a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk about today, about focus, right? The idea of saying, hey, rather than try to do everything a little bit, we need to find out the 1 or 2 things that really play to our strengths, the 1 or 2 things that are really going to set us apart, and focus all our time and energy on that. Otherwise, we'll sort of wash away. If we try to do everything a little bit, everything will turn out mediocre. And they told us that lesson a lot when we were a startup, when we were 2 people, 4 people, 8 people, et cetera. But what's crazy is we've seen giant companies the size of Apple succeed, and they still believe in these things every single day. They still hold all hands and tell all their staff, hey, we need to focus, right? If you think about a company like Apple, it's got 8 products and like 40,000 people working on 8 products. So if that's not focus, I don't know what is. And so, I can go on and on about things that I feel like skills you're going to need to learn while you're in this environment that will fade, and you will have to change the way you do things as you grow, and you have to take on different challenges and drop some old habits. But also skills and habits you can build today that will last forever. Things that no matter how big this company gets and how much success you see are still important to stand up for, and sort of you never need to stop worrying about them, and you can always get better. And so I think that's a good starting point for how we want to have this conversation. We can cover the scope of things like team dynamics. We can cover the scope of things like product strategy. We can cover the scope of things like how to collaborate or anything under the sun. The other thing I'll point out is after being part of StartX, I've also coached now between 200 and 300 companies on these types of questions too. So I won't just be speaking from my own experience, but from all the other startups that are in the Stanford ecosystem and what they've learned along the way, and whether there are lessons that they have to share with you as well.
Fantastic. I think that's a really good point to start a conversation at, because focus is actually something that we at Vertigrowth have a lot of questions on and think about all the time. And so I have one question that I collected that speaks actually lots of the points that you've touched on already, but we do want to hear a little bit more about that. So the question is, there has been a general lack of focus for a product historically. We take on a feature or a product, another project comes up, and we take that on. We've ended up with a lot of open projects over the years that were half completed because we keep switching to new things instead of finishing what we started. The project churn is also demoralizing, I've been pointing out by ex-employees in exit interviews. How would you ensure there's a balance of finishing existing projects versus new projects?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I want to caveat the answer to this question by saying there's a very big difference between running an experiment and picking something that we're going to focus on. So in order to identify what it is you need to focus on, you need to have a really good understanding of what's going to resonate with your customers, what's going to make those customers successful, and also what are your strengths as individuals, as a team, and as a company. What makes you stand out, and how do you play to your strengths? But to do that, there's a ton of experimentation along the way. And what's important to understand is when you are doing something, whether it's an experiment or whether we're doing it because that's the thing we want to focus on and we've put a lot of thought into understanding, we don't want to deviate from that or distract ourselves from that. Even companies like Apple and Amazon or any of the giant companies you name under the sun, there are huge numbers of experiments, projects that are cut all the time. If you think about, I think Apple even has a whole division called SPG, where all they do is new experimental products, most of which never see the light of day. Tim Cook is famous for, I think in the year that I joined, going publicly and saying what the recipe, he became CEO, he was like learning about all these things, trying to understand and communicate what made Apple successful. And he said, one thing that we do better than anyone else is we're willing to take 1,000 ideas, try them all out, whether thinking about it or experimenting, and then as quickly as possible saying no to 999 of them so we can take the one that's a yes and drive that all the way home. One of the points you made is that cutting projects can be demoralizing. I think if you realize that we're running this experiment to learn what it is we need to focus on, then the whole point is to cut it. And if you're on a project and you're worried about cutting it because, I don't know, you have your identity attached to this project or you feel like you're doing a bad job, if it's canceled, then that won't work, whether you're in a startup or whether you're in a $1 trillion company like Apple. I think real success comes from a willingness to treat experiments as experiments and a willingness to treat a focused strategy as a focused strategy and knowing which is which. And pushing back when someone asks you to do something, you say, hey, I don't know, are you asking me to do this as an experiment or are you asking me to do this because this is something that we all need to do together. And you may realize that 999 out of 1,000 times it is an experiment, but the purpose of the experiment is to better understand that one thing that we do need to stick to. And if you can make that part of the conversation, it's no longer about demoralizing versus motivation or focus versus defocus. Every experiment you run is to create more focus. If you don't have more focus after your experiments, ask what you were experimenting on in the first place. And what's interesting is founders and especially leadership at companies, in this case Thomas, John, and Mark, they face a lot of different options as they go out there interacting with customers and interacting with the board and different strategies that appear. And in their mind, it may not always be clear that when they say, hey, do something, that you immediately interpret that as, oh, yes, because we want this experiment, because we're going to learn this thing so we can figure out what we can focus on, versus, oh, you're asking me to do this because this is really important, this is the thing we want to channel all our energy into. It's okay to ask. And even better, it's okay to add your own opinion. Say, hey, you know what, thanks for that idea. It does make a great experiment. Let me put a time frame on it. We'll say, let's work as hard as we can on this for 4 months, as if we were going to do it forever. But then at the 4-month mark, we're all going to sit back and say, here's what we wanted to learn, here's what we did learn, and here's what it tells us about what our focus should be. I don't know if that answers your question or creates more. In an ideal world, it creates more questions and we can go deeper. But hopefully that changes the way you think about, hey, I'm being asked to do this, and then someone's changed their mind. That has to happen for any organization to learn. And more importantly, when you do this well and you're deliberate about experiments and you're deliberate about focus, incredible things can happen.
Yeah, I actually have a question. My question kind of touched on it a lot about focus strategy. I think having the courage to really identify and kind of double down on one or two things is definitely important. Can you give some examples of companies you've mentored or monitored and how they might have done something like this?
Sure. So there's a company named Bolt that we have, for example. They're up in SF, and I remember when they first came to us, they came out of the Stanford Bitcoin blockchain ecosystem. This was still when crypto was really early, and they were looking at it, and they did a couple things really well. Early on, they asked, okay, we're probably better versed at Bitcoin than most of these companies that are out there, or still very new at the time. And they knew we needed to do something that plays to our strength. If this is the strength we bring, we need to solve a problem that people don't have. And when they went out to try to do that, they spent a lot of their time on payments. The idea of like, hey, we still don't have peer-to-peer payments. Even today, it's like maybe Venmo is a little standard. Apple Pay, you can iMessage people money, and like, okay, everyone's got a little bit of everything, but it's not. It's probably more established now than it was back then. And they asked the question, well, okay, could we make this the way that people pay each other? We'll make a mobile app, we'll do it, and they're going to do it through blockchain in the background so that they don't need to involve all the banks and have all the things that sort of stop people from succeeding. So they spent a lot of time with this, and they understood that they needed to do tests on different customer types, different product types, different things. But what they realized was as they worked with more and more, to make this work, they had to work with corporate partners, people who would want these payment channels or to be able to sell into them or be part of them or have merchant exercise and whatnot. And as I worked with more and more merchants, they realized, they were, of course, experimenting with different things. Hey, we can get you a better rate. We can get you more users. We can have less fraud or whatever. And on that path, so today, I think they just raised like a Series B. They're valued at like, $200, $300 million or something. And that was only a few years ago. And they've built a business today on reducing fraud for merchants, and that's it. So their whole, when they started, it was all about, and I think Vertigris has a lot of parallels too, right? There's this open-ended question of like, how do we make building smarter? How do we solve the energy problem that the world is facing? But along the way, there's a ton of different dimensions that are going to make things go. And I remember even when John first mentioned the thought that like, oh, what if, it looks like we could take an HVAC and tell you if it's going to fail before it fails. That could be your fraud, right? Not that you're doing fraud, but that could be for Bolt, what ended up being fraud prevention ended up being their whole business. And now they're one of the leading online e-commerce platforms for if you want to do checkout and you want all these advanced ways to prevent fraud. And that's built them into a giant company. Now, have they left payments? No. But is their product everything for payments under the sun? Absolutely not. And if they tried to do that, they would do every aspect of payments in a mediocre way. But instead, they're saying, we're going to do fraud prevention and just fraud prevention, and they're going to be the best of the best at it. I don't know what that will be for Vertigris, and I think everyone here has to work together as a team to run those experiments, to learn those things, to figure out what the answer is. But if we're determined to do that, and we understand that the point of starting things that are going to end is to learn from them so that we can find that focus that's really going to take us to the next level, it'll be an exciting journey rather than a demotivating one.
Any more questions on focus or strategy?
I guess I have a question. How do you know when that company has found that product market fit? So how did Bolt know that fraud was there?
Yeah, so there are two ways to answer this question. I guess I'll repeat the question for the recording. How do they know that they found product market fit? How do they know that this is the thing that they want to do? And the two ways to answer that question is one, there's got to be a lot of pull, right? So when you talk to customers, and I imagine that's the growth team, but I don't know if the product people go and spend time with customers. I don't know if the IoT people do that. But when you talk to your customers, they will all have pain points, right? You could be, even if you didn't have the ability to measure anything, like if you were selling them paint for painting their walls, and you talk to a facilities manager and they say, oh man, but like, what if, it's like, oh, this HVAC broke again, and like, oh, I gotta like, oh, these things. The problems that people face exist whether you are trying to sell them something or not. And I think that's really important to understand, because product market fit, so the first part of the answer is that product market fit has to come from the pain points that they hold, the top pain points that they hold. It is not a question of would this be valuable to them. And so you could go to, as payments as an example, with Bolt, they say, hey, would it be valuable if I had 200 million users just transacting money and then you could use them as merchants? Of course, the answer is yes. But if you ask them unprompted, what are the top things that bother you on a day-to-day basis, there's going to be someone there that's like, oh my God, we lose like 15% of our watches.com. You go there and like it's all fraud, people stolen credit cards and whatnot, and it ends up we have to pay that money back. And so an unprompted understanding of the pain points of the people you meet is probably the number one way to understand whether there will be product market fit. Okay, that's the first half, the pull side. There's also a push side. So the idea that you will be able to do this better than anyone else. It's not necessary. You won't find product market fit in a sustainable way, even if you found these pain points. But this isn't the group to go solve it, right? If for some reason all the people you talk to are like, oh, I wish I could do more interpretive dance at work. Like I just that's the number one thing, and everything else is fine. I just want more interpretive dance. I'm pretty sure this is not the team that's going to show up and give them more interpretive dance, right? That's not going to happen. And so you do need to understand what are you best at, and what really makes this group special, this technology special, your positioning in the market, what infrastructure you have already, what data you have already, and the team that you put in place, and all these things. And really say, yeah, you know what, this is a pain point that most people are listing unprompted, and we really could do this better than what's out there, and it really could be a big deal. And it's got to be both. You can't ever solve these just one way. If you say, hey, this is the thing we can do, we can be better than anyone, and no one is listing this as a pain point, you don't have a business necessarily yet. But you may have a lot of opportunities to run some really valuable experiments to find something. And the flip side is also true, right? If you don't, if people are listing this as a pain point, everyone wants to do interpretive dance, doesn't mean you should go do it. Does that answer your question?
I have a follow-up on that. Have you seen any correlation from your experiences between company that has product market fit and kind of how that's correlated to the sales cycles?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And for the recording, is there any correlation between product market fit and sales cycles? The common trap, I think, where these things intersect is that if I, as they say in the D school all the time, if I say, hey, do you want a jelly bean? Your answer is going to be yes. You ask any customer, hey, do you want everything the same in your life and also one more jelly bean? Probably the answer is yes. And so, but if you say, hey, what are the number one things that bother you? It could be, and remember, companies don't have problems, people have problems. Okay, this is really important. You can't say, oh, NVIDIA needs XYZ, or Genentech needs XYZ. You need to say, so-and-so has whatever specific life problem that they're dealing with. It could be that facilities managers, the number one thing is they hate their boss. It's just notoriously mismanaged. They really have a bad work environment. All they want to do is make their boss happier, right? And if that's the case, that's the problem that you would need to solve to have product market fit with that buyer. But different people will buy from you at different companies. And to figure out the profile of the buyer and the person you want to talk to, you can't ask them, would you buy this? Right? Being able to sell something doesn't necessarily mean you have product market fit. Knowing that this is an unprompted top pain point of an individual, a class, a profile of individual that you can find in a repeatable way, and then presenting something to them, obviously you have to be able to sell it. You can botch any sales call by doing it poorly. But the analogy we always give is this. Imagine that you're lying in a hospital and you have cancer and there's no cure. And someone walks in and say, hey, you know what, I heard you have cancer, and oh, by the way, I have this magic black box, and if you shake it, cancer goes away. And they're oh, but I'm busy, I have to leave. Okay, a couple things are gonna happen. One, you're super skeptical. You're what? There's no magic black box. I'm pretty sure cancer is we're not really close to curing that. What are you talking about? Okay. And B, even if it worked, I don't know, I really don't believe this is possible. But you're still gonna say, well, hold on. Can I talk to you for 10 more seconds? Because I need to know if this is real, right? Okay. Different than if you don't have cancer, you have you have whatever, arthritis, and I come in and I'm like, hey, I have this box, it cures cancer, and like you can shake it and cure cancer, and like I promise it's real. Even if you're convinced it's real, it doesn't matter to you, right? Even if there's a ton of other people in the world for which this is important, and even more people at the same company that would bite on that pain point, it doesn't mean it's relevant to you. And if you're the buyer and you're in charge of you're part of that conversation of whether to make this purchase decision, it's not going to move the needle. So from a sales point of view, I really care about, you can sell in a startup, in the early startup world. It is often important to make sales that don't fully align with the product market fit that you need, so that you have more people you can test on, you have more data you can work with, you have real deployments that you can iron out the kinks with, and you get revenue along the way. It lets you build a team, lets you hire people, it's great people to work with. But Apple, companies like Apple and Amazon, they don't really do that, right? They're not going to launch a product just to have like 8 people buy it and be like, aha, I got 8 people to try it, and that's not interesting to them. So this is one skill that is especially important to focus on at your size that definitely goes away as you talk, bigger companies, and it's okay that it goes away later, and it's important to understand now. But when you take on a customer and hey, we signed this person because we had amazing, it's like, oh my God, we just like wizarded them into buying it, and like it's still gonna have some value to them, but I know this isn't a top pain point for them, then treat it like an experiment. Understand what you can learn from this. Hey, can we test features on them before we give them to the people that matter, so that the bugs are gone before it shows up in our likely to renew customers? Can we like A/B test with their data sets or something in some way that like we can learn from them, and then see if they like these reports or whatever before we give them the other ones? Can we try different pricing on them, et cetera, right? When you know something's an experiment, you can move the company forward so much, because you can ask questions you wouldn't usually ask. And when you know it's not an experiment, you need to make sure you're giving a consistent experience. So the opposite is also true. If you find someone who really does have product market fit, where you're like, hey, our big pitch, I'm just using HVACs as an example, like, I don't know, I thought it was cool. I'm totally out, don't take my word for this being the right business strategy, but like imagine, like, it's like, oh my God, HVACs is gonna be the thing. And you find someone where like, this is what they care about, they're willing to pay a ton to make sure that it doesn't happen, they don't have unexpected, they can fix them ahead of time. You don't want to try to oversell them on it. Right? If you find someone for which this is their pain point, and you like wizard them into a sale, you don't know if they would have bought it if you put like a less trained salesperson or like didn't push as hard to try to get the sale, right? So when you're trying to get the repeatable customer, it's all about figuring out whether they're really drawn to it. And when you're trying to get experimental customers, you can push as hard as you want to try to close them, because A, it brings in revenue, it gives you testing platforms and whatever. One of the most counterintuitive pieces of advice I see given around to early stage startups is like, try harder not to sell your product. Like, go find someone, like, in the cancer box example, it's like, don't go in and be like, oh my God, I've cured these 5 people, and like, oh my God, amazing. Just wave it in front of them and be like, hey, I think I have this box, I think it'll solve your problem, and like, oh, never mind, I gotta go. And then like, whoa, I want to talk to you, like, I don't want to talk to you, like, blah, blah, blah. And they will chase you out the door if it really matters to them, and that's how you know that you have product market fit. But again, in terms of focus versus experiments, you gotta understand that when you find a customer like that, that's a worthwhile test to do, to see how strong the pull is in the market. But you don't want to treat your experimental customers like that. You'll lose them, you won't get revenue, and you won't have things to work on. So it's really understanding that startups are a balance, but giant companies do this too. They're just much, much better at it. And as soon as you can see every opportunity as 2 choices, rather than like stop, go, or like, like failure because it's shut down, success if it's still going, the entire conversation changes, and we see that shift in our startups when they sort of like make that connection.
Well, I have a follow-up question on that. So you talked a lot about experimentation and learning through that, and why a big reason to have experiments is so that some projects can be canceled and we pivot and things like that. But how do you balance good experimentation with a good customer experience? Mm-hmm. Because we've definitely had this problem in the past. So there's 2 parts to this question. Like, how do you choose what to experiment on, but then also how do you talk about customer experience? I'll start by talking, so Branch Metric, you may know about them, they're a Stanford GSB company. They were StartX's first $1 billion enterprise company. And when they started, they were just for GSB students off doing some, starting their company. And when they hit $1 billion, one of their co-founders came back, Mike, and he said, hey, I want to have like a discussion group with all the different entrepreneurs that you have here, to share my thoughts on like, hey, I was the one doing the sales back
when we were 4 people. I'm still the one doing the sales now that we're a $1 billion company. And I want to go over what changes and what's the same, how we approach sales now as a $1 billion company that we built on from what we started, and also what I wish I had done earlier on. And one of the things that it's a long conversation, but the founders have access to it. One of the things that struck me is he said, I'm still experimenting every day, every week, every quarter on how we can improve our sales and what we'll do better. And they're a $1 billion company, and he's got like a bunch of employees. He's like just one of the co-founders who's still doing that. And so experimentation never stops if you want to improve. But understanding which of your customers are for learning and which of your customers are to test the repeatability, I think makes a big difference, right? So if you could, and I don't know if you have, labeled, and we encourage all our startups to do this, which is like label all your customers and mark like on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being like, okay, this represents our core demographic, one that we have to win. And this represents like, they're very, very poorly aligned, but they keep renewing for some reason or whatever, and we can learn from them. And make sure the customer experience, there's 2 ways to answer this question. You can test whether the customer experience is good on the people you need to renew so that it's representative for them. And so that you know that like at this expected customer experience, we can get renewals and we have the product market fit, and this is a working, growable strategy, right? You don't need to worry about the customer experience for the experimental ones. In fact, it's better to experiment with different customer experiences. The flip side of this, though, is the point I made earlier, which is you can actually try harder not to give a good customer experience, usually not on purpose. That's usually a bad idea. But the thought is, look, if I offer a really bad customer experience, but I cure your cancer, no one is going to say no to that if that's a real pain point for them. So when you make the customer experience too good, it will mask your ability to understand whether there is product market fit. I'm going to repeat that point. It's very important. If you make the customer experience too polished, you may not be able to learn whether there is product market fit at all. They may only use it because it was polished, and you won't learn anything from that exchange. So think carefully about when you want to offer, wait for polish, and when you don't. And if you're going to lose someone because it's not polished, and you think they're a representative customer, my guess is that they're not a representative customer. If you're going to lose someone and you're sure they're a representative customer, like and say all the data, all the experiments you've run show that like okay, HVACs are the thing. Like all we got to do is make sure all their HVACs are like lots, early notice, very reliable. All the other things can be buggy and fall apart all the time. And if you lose someone because they're like, oh, but it was buggy and it fell apart, then like, did they really care about the HVACs? And were you right about your strategy? And so my opinion is that the level of polish is a tool. It's not. It's funny because you look at a company like Apple or any of our giant billion-dollar companies, and you go and they're like, you use the products and you're like, oh, you know why I love Apple is because it's so polished. But it's not. There's like bugs all the time, and like there's antenna gate and the maps and the like crashes and various things. But there's still things that draw you to it. And the same thing is true in the startup world. If you're making a polished product just so you can be proud that it's polished, you may be doing a disservice to your teammates, to the people that work so hard on like trying to bring these customers in and trying to learn what's product market fit and trying to get revenue or trying to build software, all of these things, right? In the design world, it's called micro-optimizing. In the software world, it's called over-engineering. And they don't have a phrase for it in the sales world that I know of, but the thought is really to pay attention to whether you've gotten the pain point down. Don't use polish as a reason to be proud, because it can often be destructive to the learning process.
Right, that's really useful. So now that about half our time is up, maybe we can shift the conversation a little bit more to the people operations side and managing sort of different sizes of teams and company culture and that and all of that. So I have another question here that touches on one of these points. So I'll just read. Some employees at Verdigris often quote growth mentality as a reason to put inexperienced people in positions of responsibility or accountability. This often leads to suboptimal situations where the junior person often learns on the job and makes mistakes that would otherwise be avoided by having an experienced person. It's a great learning opportunity for that junior employee, but these sort of organizational experiments also tend to slow down overall velocity of the team or organization. Should every employee's opinions have equal weighting, or should it be weighted by experience? And how would you ensure the organization elect the experienced people in positions of accountability while also fostering an environment for junior employees to grow through experience?
Okay, this is a really long question. There's a lot of pieces to it, but I think they're all important things to talk about. So maybe we'll do them one at a time. There's an open question, first and foremost, around who should be doing what. And in a startup world, this is definitely very different in a big company as it is in the startup world. Obviously, in a big company, like if you have a role, just hire for it. And like if you don't have a hire, just wait till you have a hire. Like, okay, it's great. Like they're hiring and firing people like on a super rapid basis. But at a company of this size, what we find is you need to be tactful about what are the most important things for this company to get right. And when you have something really critical, and this is hard to think about because like everything seems important, right? And so you really have to ask like, okay, if we can't, I don't know, like if we can't find product market fit in the next 3 months, the company like will not survive. I don't think that's true. I think it usually takes much, much longer, but like imagine, right? Or you could say, oh, if we can't like ship this particular feature like in the next 3 months, then we have all our customers are gonna quit. Like, okay, again, I don't think that's real, but like imagine you had a situation like this. Things that are absolutely mission critical, and I'll caveat that again, or maybe I'll do it later by saying like, everything you work on or every need that you feel is going to seem mission critical because in the startup world, you know, humans have a natural bias toward just like exposure to what they experience. But if you really can like take a step back and say, okay, as a company as a whole, for the good of the company as a whole, if I had to pick like 2 things that this company absolutely needs, what are those? Those top things, often you need to make sure that people who are most likely to pull them off are the ones doing them. There are going to be a ton of things that you think are super, super important, like, oh my God, this gets in my way every day, like whatever so-and-so is happening, and like I wish someone was better at doing it, or they're asking me to do this, and I don't know if I'm ready for it. And again, in a big company, when that happens, like that's terrible. Like, why don't we just hire someone to do, I don't know, like the social media campaigns, because like I don't know how to do it, and like we'll just wait till we have someone to do it. But in a small company, if you're being asked to do the social media campaigns, you're like, well, I've never done this before, and like how am I going to figure it out? The answer might be that the person more skilled is being put on something that's critical. And it's the best thing for the team as a whole to make sure that they get to do that. So if you're able to take a step back and just like separate from your own sort of that natural human recency bias of sort of your own availability bias, I think is what it's called, of the things that affect you, and really say, okay, if I were at the top down and saying there's a couple things that are critical, make sure those people are doing those things, and in exchange for helping create this environment that I get to work with those people and these customers and products, I will have to do some things that I feel scared that I might not be able to do well, but it's creating space for other people to do the things that at least in this 3 months are critical or whatever, and they can shift from time to time. That's good. Okay, so now the flip side, I think there's another part of this question, which was like, okay, but what about growth mindset? What about the idea that you need to, like, let's learn things and do things that we can't do? So growth mindset doesn't mean everybody should learn everything. If everyone needs to learn everything, no matter how growth mindset you are, it's like exhausting, and also there's a lack of focus, a lack of specialization, and like everyone's just gonna be mediocre at everything, right? Even people, so like like famous, whether it's like Barack Obama at giving speeches or like Roger Federer at playing tennis, like yeah, they probably have amazing growth mindset. That's how they've gotten so far. But like, Roger Federer didn't get good at tennis by like also trying to play 4 other sports at the same time, right? So in my mind, growth mindset is super important. You can't ever let that go. But a big part of growth mindset is understanding that failure is part of learning. It has nothing to do with try to learn everything, and everything to do with, hey, like I did something, people were upset with my work. Great. that means I'm not as good as I thought I was, and now I'm getting direct ideas for how I can improve. Or I tried to launch a product and the customers hated it. And that's great because now we're learning more about the customers and I'm learning more about my approach to deciding why did I think the customers would like it, what information did I use, could I have learned more from more people. Growth mindset is a lot about, when we talk about experiments versus focus for the group, I treat growth mindset as experiments versus focus for just individuals, right? The idea of saying, hey, here are some skills I know I need to get better at for me to really like be good for this team, and that's what people are asking me to get better at. But in doing so, I'm going to fail along the way. If you don't fail, you're not getting better. If you don't take on challenges that are harder than you can reach, you're not stretching yourself to improve at something. That is growth mindset. I see a lot of people who, and it's common human nature to say like, hey, oh my God, like I worked really hard on this thing, and then like I went to a meeting and like I got chewed out by these, that was like not good enough, or like, oh my God, they thought I made all these mistakes, I'm pretty sure I didn't make any mistakes. When your reaction to people having, or just like outcomes being disappointing is like, oh no, I failed, as long as you know that like, but that's okay because I chose to try something harder than I can handle as part of a way to learn that. That's fine. If you're saying, hey, I'm focusing on this thing and I'm doing this and I know I'm going to be good at it. Like I've done this 9 or 10 times in a row and I've done it like, it's been amazing every single time. Like I could do this in my sleep. Then you're choosing to do this for the purpose of focus. You're saying, hey, the company needs me to do this and I'm going to do it. I'm the best person to do it. So remember that. Well, I don't think. I think there may have been a growth mindset is this phrase thrown around. We've worked with Carol Dweck's lab, and it's become this huge ordeal, and so people sort of use that phrase to mean many, many things. But what I would challenge you to think about is like, if you want to improve at something, you need to fail along the way. That's what improvement looks like and feels like. And if you understand that concept, then I think you're embracing growth mindset well. If you take growth mindset to me like, okay, I need to like divide my work over a million different things, I don't think that's what growth mindset is about, but I do think, back to my first point, there are going to be situations where that's the best use of the group. And as long as you're taking that hit to move the team forward, people will appreciate that, whether they call it out or not. There was probably more to this question, this like multi-layered 10-level question. So if there's any concepts that I missed or anyone want to jump in with more thoughts there, I'm happy to go into them. We see a large range of companies that have really healthy team dynamic and companies that still there's a lot of like thrashing here and there around sort of getting that settled over the 500, 600 companies that we have. And this is definitely a big part of it. When I see when I see teams where they're still learning what their identity is, a lot of the time it's like, hey, I don't feel appreciated because people think like I'm being asked to do something I can't do, and then people are expecting me to do more than I can, and then being disappointed about that. But that would not be growth mindset, right? Because if you're up for the challenge of doing something you've never done before, then the reason to do it is to just do it better than you expected, right? Put in your best effort, and if you land higher than what you thought, then that should be great. If you hold yourself to an unrealistic bar, that's actually a fixed mindset, measuring yourself against something that you can't reach. It's okay to do something you're not good at, as long as you challenge yourself to just be better than you were last time.
Yeah, I think one of the key parts of this question was just that a lot of things at a startup will seem mission critical. So does it make sense to put an experienced person on something like that at all? But I think you really answered that in pointing out that really, there's maybe only a couple key points that are really mission critical, and a lot of other things are about experimentation and so forth. Okay.
You also asked about weight on the.
Oh yeah, opinion. So do you want to get to that point? Like, should
yeah.
everyone's opinion be weighted the same? And I'm assuming that
yes.
question is about weighting opinions around who should do what. or just weighting opinions in general?
I think
when you
like
have
in terms of
different
decision making.
Yeah, so I actually, so I'll tell you that what seems to work really well in decision making is having good reasons for things, not doing what the majority votes for. A great way to create discrimination is to follow the majority, as is obvious, the common statement that people talk about, right? We only have minorities and we only have discrimination because of majority rule, right? If we had a rule that if we instead said, oh, majorities aren't important, we just need good reasons for things, you could have discrimination for other ways, but following the majority just through a vote is a very, very easy way to forget that you will discriminate every time you do that, unless it's unanimous. So how do we make decisions then, especially when things are hard? The analogy I give all the time is like, okay, if people agree, like if it's obvious everyone agrees, then okay, just do it, it's fine. But there will be cases where there are people in the room, often important stakeholders, that have a differing view on how an opinion should be settled. And the example I give is, imagine we're building a catapult, okay, or like, I don't know, a ladder to the moon. And I say, oh, we need like X amount of bricks. We're making a ladder out of bricks to go to the moon, so this is gonna fail anyway. But imagine we have X amount of bricks to like, we need like 50,000 bricks to go to the moon. And you're like, oh, I think we need 100,000 bricks to go to the moon. We could disagree because it's gonna change where the budget goes. It's gonna change how much time we have to spend on it. It's gonna change who we have to put on it. And like, I may disagree, you may disagree, and we may have like we may not know how to settle that problem. And we could say, okay, let's just vote, everyone just vote, and then do the one that's right. But sometimes the dissenting voice is the most important because they're pointing something out that the rest of us at group think about. So what do we do? In this analogy, I always like to say, look, if you come into a conversation and you're convinced it's 50,000 bricks, and the minute someone says, oh, but I think it's 100,000 bricks, rather than say, no, I need to convince you, or like, oh, you must have these biases and you're wrong, I always challenge our founders to ask, or anybody who works at a startup to ask, like, wait, oh my God, that's so amazing because I couldn't believe how anyone could come to a different conclusion. I thought it was obvious. And since it's not obvious, there's something I still have to learn. So what is it? What do you know that I don't know? This is now a really valuable conversation for me. I always find that when I'm trying to convince someone of something, I don't learn anything new because all I do is repeat things that I've said. And it's possible that in a debate, like someone could point something out and on occasion, like you'd be like, oh yeah, that was convincing, and then you leave, but you sort of shut yourself out to learning new information. When two people disagree, almost always the right answer is some third answer that neither of you have thought of, and it requires you to figure out, okay, what do you know that I don't know? And what do I know that you don't know? And how can we combine all of that to come up with a third answer? So when people disagree, I usually challenge them to say, okay, first and foremost, both of your answers must be wrong because you must both be missing something on the other side. Come up now with a third answer by combining what you both know to make that happen. Okay, now this sounds great. And it should work a lot of the time, especially when you feel like your default reaction is like, oh no, I need to convince you. And instead just be like, wow, that means there's something I can learn because you came to a different conclusion than me. What do you know that I don't know? This will still sometimes not be possible though, right? You could say like, oh, because I went to Wikipedia and like, it says you need this number of bricks to get to the moon. I'm like, okay, that's cool, but like citation needed. And I'm like, well, I went to this like YouTube video where like some 6-year-old was doing a science fair project and they said they need this much. I'm like, okay, so like, how do you know which one? Like there's random people who've analyzed Wikipedia. It's a 6-year-old, how does this person know anything? And there may not be enough time to go solve that problem. You may believe something, I may believe something, and we may not just be able to we don't have infinite amount of money or resources to go run this experiment. And when that happens, I usually, the most secure way to resolve that conflict is to then ask, okay, we're not gonna be able to get the answer to this prediction. Almost always has to be a differing prediction on something. If you have different facts, then combine all your facts. If you have different assumptions, sometimes you can measure those assumptions, right? Like, okay, well, Wikipedia says a brick is only 1 inch high and Kid says brick is 1 foot high. So like, let's just go measure it and find out. But there will be unmeasurable assumptions that at the end of the day, we need to make a decision because we're in a startup. And so we're just going to make a bet. And I think when you call out that we're making a bet, it changes, it makes the conversation much safer because we know when we're making a bet, we don't have to be right. The whole point of making a bet is that we might not be right. We're making a bet because we're forced to make a decision. We've already combined the best decision we can. And then the one rule for making bets is you have to close your eyes and say, hey, if this bet goes horribly wrong, who would end up having to sweep up the mess? So at Apple, a great example was like, okay, there was some debate about like which database should we use. Should we use like Cassandra or like whatever this or whatever that? And like people had a million reasons, like, oh, but this will be better for the users and this will scale better and like whatever that, but we just didn't have time to test it. And so at the end of the day, there were like 3 different opinions, and the call we made was like, okay, look, say we have to make a bet. We have no choice now. And say we're wrong, who's gonna have to clean up the mess? And it was like, I don't know, Adam and Jay. And we're like, okay, Adam, like then whatever bet you want to make, you make, because if you're right, you're going to have a really pleasant experience. And if you're wrong, that was you got to make, we gave you, we're letting you make the bet, and we know that it's going to fall on you to fix it if you're wrong. And that creates a lot of alignment because A, they'll take the bet seriously, right? Because like we're not database engineers. We just have opinions that we read on different things and we were sure it was going to be better. And like, I think like, we use this a lot, and like sometimes I was actually right, and they ended up having to fix the mess, but they were okay with it. Like there's a difference between saying, hey, yeah, like we put this bet, I decided I was going to make it, and I know I have to clean up the mess, and like, okay, now I have to work extra hours to like convert do our migration because like, yeah, someone told me it'd be worse, and like I was just sure this wouldn't happen. But like, look, I put my money where my mouth is, and I'm going to do it, and they felt better about it, and they felt ownership, and they felt autonomy, and it was all really great. And the flip side is also right. Sometimes I was wrong. I was like, look, I'm pretty sure I've been doing this. I started this company, like this is what we got to do, but like it's your bet because. Anyway, if shit hit the fan, you're gonna have to fix it. And they're like, fine, then we're doing XYZ, and like they did XYZ, and there were no problems, and like everyone's happy. So understand when you can combine information and make a better decision. Always, 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 that's your top choice. But sometimes you have to make a bet and call it out when it's a bet, and then really think carefully. There were some times where we were in this conversation and we're like, okay, yeah, we want to make a bet, and like we're deciding like whether the data should be served from like a data center or like stored on phones or like whatever. And I was like, you know what? None of us can make that bet. Like it's got to go up to our VP because if we're wrong, like we may have to actually like ship a software fix. So we went up to him, we called a meeting, we're like, look, this is what we're facing. Here are the options, and like I need you to make we can. If you're deferring the decision to us, we'll make it. But I want to let you know that this, it could affect you. I want to make sure your opinion goes in, and they're always very opinionated, and they always make a decision, so it's fine. But I think it really aligns people in a really healthy way, rather than be this debate about you're right and I'm wrong. You can really make it about like, look, people are going to face the consequences of their decisions, and so we want to make sure the decisions fall on the people where the consequences are most natural. And this is a skill you have to learn. People don't calculate, they don't approach decisions this way, or they don't approach bets this way. And so I bet what will happen is the first few times you do this, you will be wrong about who's supposed to make the bet. And that's okay, have a discussion about it. And if you disagree, you can try combining your information, right? There's probably some third option, some third person who should be making a bet, and just like put your thoughts together. But once you get this down, decisions don't become stressful anymore. They actually become really, really engaging, rewarding, and you sort of like hope there are more decisions to be made because it empowers you in your day and it makes everyone else feel better. And like when people have to come in for extra hours to do extra work, it's because they made a call and like they knew the risks when they put on the uniform, so to speak.
Any follow-ups to that? If not, I think we'll switch to the last point that you mentioned earlier about basically differences between working at a small company versus a big company. So actually getting a little bit more to your specific experience, but what changed when you moved from Wi-Fi Slam to Apple in terms of company culture, and what things were you able to preserve?
Yeah, so I think, I touched on some of these at the beginning, things that we're always harping on like our 2-people startups to do is like stay laser focused, understand that your goal is to find focus, not to like arbitrarily be focused. If you're gonna make a bet about it, then be clear that it's a bet. If you're gonna like run the experiments to find out, be clear that that's what we're doing. We also talk a lot about playing to your strengths, making sure that when you make decisions, you're really focused on what do we do better than other people, or even like on a team, or as a company, or as a product, or as a technology. Like decision-making criteria like this. Like, so Apple has all this management training around how to like have healthy debate, and it's really, it's the same types of conversations where we have like 2 founders in the room, the trajectory of the company depends on it, and they're still deciding. I've seen companies say, hey, like, it's going to be fraud. I mean, Bolt talked about this. Like, it's going to be fraud. I don't know if I'm right, but we've got to bet the company on it, on something. Because if we try to do like 6 things in payments, all of them are going to fail. And we don't know for sure. I can't predict the future and tell you that fraud is going to be the thing that works. But I'm willing to say, look, if this doesn't work, I'll get all of you guys a job, and like I'll go raise the money. Like, I'll just like brute force do the fundraising with the investors, and like we will push this along. I'm making this bet because I'm comfortable making it, and I'm willing to own the consequences. And so, as big of a decision or as small of a decision, these things can. And we've seen tiny like hey, should we get gluten-free whatever for lunch? And people are like, no, I don't think anyone's gonna show up that's gluten-free. And then like someone does, and like, okay, great, I'm gonna like run down to the store, I'm gonna pick something up, like, I'll stop my day, and like we're gonna bring something to them, and it'll be great. And so it's okay to use this on small decisions as well as big decisions. In terms of, I think something that's really valuable that big companies do that I think is still really important at small companies is knowing always knowing who you can look up to on a particular skill. So, if you're trying to learn a particular skill, it may not be that they're your manager. It may not be that you even get time with them on a regular basis, but at least having someone you can look to, or knowing that we don't know it is okay too. We've had startups where like they don't have a good, let's say like database engineer, and so they're doing a bunch of things, and like they're good at product, they're good at design, they're good at like front end, they're good at whatever. But like when it comes to database decisions, everyone just has a bunch of different opinions, and it creates more conversation than they need. The day some senior database engineer shows up, like everything just becomes more settled. And that happens in the startup world. That can happen when there's 3 people. That also happens when it's huge. Like, right, like if no one's owning databases, or you don't have expertise, and suddenly they like build a team to go do it, everything just sort of gets better. But the key is not waiting for that to happen. The key to success is understanding how you operate before it happens. Right? There will be a whole, especially in the startup world, there will be a whole number of things that there just isn't expertise for. Like, you may be like, well, I'm not good at this, but there might not be anyone better than me at it. Or if there is, it's like, well, that person is so busy, they're doing this other thing that, yes, as I step back, it is mission critical. So like, I guess it's on me. I'm gonna go learn this, I'm gonna figure it out. And I know I'm going to be wrong. So I don't have to feel like, okay, now that they've given me this thing I have to do, now I have to like present that I'm the best and all my answers are correct, and like you should totally follow what we're doing. You can go out, you can seek advice, you can tell people, hey, I don't know what I'm doing, but we're going to do this the best we can because the person who does know what they're doing is doing this other thing, and that's okay, that's good for us. Just having a conversation about making sure expectations match the reasons that we're doing things. And it's okay. And you'll find, I mean, Carol Dweck, the reason growth mindset is such a big deal is they have found that when people admit that they can't do something, and that they're going to fail along the way as a way to get better at it, you improve way faster. So you might be surprised when all you do is sort of like lower that shield for yourself. Just be a little more vulnerable and understand that like, look, I'm being asked to do this thing and I don't think I can handle it, but I'm gonna tell people that I don't think I can handle it. I'm gonna tell people I'm still gonna do my best, and I tell people that I'm gonna learn, like, show me all my mistakes, whether you, you could think it's a mistake and be wrong. You could think it was a mistake and be right, but like feed them to me so I can learn. Those people improve way, way faster in those situations. Anyway, and you might turn out to be good enough to actually do it in a very short amount of time. So that is like an inherent trait of sort of like human growth, and it doesn't matter whether you're on $1 billion company, $1 trillion company, or 20 people.
Any follow-up questions?
I have one question. I'm wondering, what are the components that show good management in a company? Like, what can you look for to know the company is being efficiently managed?
Okay. What can you look for to see if a company is being sufficiently managed? Like sufficiently, efficiently. So Yeah, this is a good one. So like, I think goal definition is really important. I would, if I had to choose between a startup that had like great managers and a startup that had a really good OKR setting process, I would pick the one with the OKR setting process. Now, you have to be sure that the OKRs are good. So what roles do managers play, right? There is in big companies, the goal of the manager is to like serve their employees, right? Like, and we always talk about, in bigger companies, we talk about if you're a manager, like your job is to do all the work that your team doesn't want to do, and your job is to make sure that they have what they need to succeed, and like that's it. And then like go interface with other teams in big companies. At a small company, if you want it, because people are wearing so many, like you can have, okay, so why does this work at a big company? It's because like when you have a team to do privacy, there's like 50 people doing privacy. So it's like 3 managers managing those 50 people, and like all they have to worry about is getting those 50 people to do privacy, okay? And so they can be privacy specialists, and they can be able to relate to the person that does the privacy and like contextualize things and support them. But in a small company, like there's like half a person doing privacy and like half a person doing social media and half a person doing this, and like everyone's wearing so many different hats that if you had a manager for each thing, there'd be more managers than people. Right? So if you had 20 people, there'd be 60 managers because of the 60 different things that are going on, which is ridiculous. And so in a startup world, and it's easy to say like, oh, but like look at all these giant successful companies, look at how their managers act. That's what we should expect from them. But remember, the only way to do that is if you have the money to hire like 60 managers for your 20 people. Otherwise, what you're asking for doesn't really match what is possible in the startup world. And so what I push for in the startup world instead is, one, understand the skills that you're expected to do, but also the skills that you want to get better at, and just know for yourself who's good at them. So you can look up to them, informally grab lunch with them, ask them for advice. Hey, I'm trying to get better at customer empathy. I'm trying to get better at like databases. Can I have lunch with you and just pick your brain on these things? Because everyone has lunch anyway. Number 2 is find someone who can help you translate feedback. So this doesn't have to be the person. Often it's someone it can be the same person as someone who's more skilled, right? If someone tells you, I think there's a really important, when you face adversity, so if you're working on something and there's a struggle, and there may be a struggle because you feel like other parts of the team aren't supporting you enough, or there may be a struggle because you've never been trained, you're not sure what to do. When you face that struggle, in the real world, sometimes you have to go through struggle to learn. In fact, that's what growth mindset is all about, right? If you went to Roger Federer and he was like, I don't like practicing my serve, I just want to like be really good at it. You'd be like, well, tough. Like, come back when you've practiced 1,000 serves and then I'll tell you what to do next. Versus if he's like, hey, my racket is broken, it's not working when I serve. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, let me get you a new racket. Like, stop doing that. Learning how to serve with a broken racket is no good. The same thing applies to any job skill that you have. You may feel like you're struggling because you don't have a skill. You may feel like you're struggling because you're not getting enough support. But a lot of the time, people get it backwards. So you may say like, oh, but I need more support. It's hard for me, like in other companies, people get more support. But the lesson might be like, for someone who is really good at this, they learn how to do it without getting that support. They learn how to do this independently, and that's just something you can get better at. The opposite is also true. You could be like, hey, I'm doing this, and like I don't feel like I'm trained well enough. Like I'm having a hard time with this. It's too hard. And the answer is like, no. You're supposed to like go ask other people, right? Like don't worry, they can help you. Ask them for 10 minutes. You need their 10 minutes, otherwise it'll take you an hour. And the only way to know that is because you can't tell if you're not at that level. You can't tell the reason that it's hard. And if someone gives you feedback saying like, oh, but like. Or if you feel like, oh, I'm not getting enough help, you don't know if you're supposed to be getting help. And so having someone who is further along, better than you at this, even if they're not your manager, just knowing who they are so you can go to them informally and say, hey, I feel like I'm running into this problem. Am I supposed to deal with it? Like, is that something I'm supposed to get better at dealing with? Or is this something where it's like, no, this is not a real problem, like just go get help and solve it? And I think that, I don't know if that was fully your question. You asked about management in general, but I think this serves the 2 biggest needs that like having 60 managers would otherwise do. You usually have someone to go to and say, hey, I'm struggling with this, and they say, okay, let me help you. Or I'm struggling with this, and like, no, that's something you have to work on. And it's really hard to get that right because you're not an expert yourself. Goal setting. We can also talk about goal setting if you want. I know that you guys use OKRs, and so it's probably a good step. I think the only thing I'll leave about OKRs is like, it's hard when you're in the moment to think about what's good for the company over the long run. When if you're setting like a 1 month OKR, or setting KR, even objectives or KRs for a month long, like in the day-to-day, you often want to do things because they're right in front of you. And challenge yourself to step back and say, okay, no, actually, if we could achieve X in a month and nothing else got done, that would actually be a home run. Taking the time to set that aside and set that up so that you know, and then you can circulate it and say, hey, tell all the other teams, like, hey, we think if we achieve these things in the next month and nothing else, it's gonna be a home run. Do you guys think so too? And like sales might show up and be like, no, of course not. Like we're trying to do these 2 experiments and that thing. Like, oh yeah, maybe we should change it. Versus like, oh yeah, that'd be amazing. Just make sure that happens. Once you have good OKR set, you can just follow them, and there's nothing will go wrong. I mean, that's extreme, but like the need for a manager is much reduced because you don't need someone guiding you day to day. You know that you got to socialize and circulate the like, hey, what if we achieve this in a month? You can spend a month achieving it. And so I feel like with good OKRs, the only thing that's missing is this idea of like, when I'm struggling, what is the right response? And it's hard unless you're the expert yourself. It's hard to know whether it's like, no, this is something that everyone goes through as they learn to get better at this, versus like, no, don't put yourself through this, like go get help. And since you don't have 60 managers, just note for yourself or ask people around to nominate, like, hey, I'm trying to learn these 3 skills. Who is good at them here at the company, or friends that you have that I can go for lunch with on the weekend?
Well, that was all thanks to Joseph for his time.
Like show it on camera?
Sure.
Look at this. Okay, guys. We got 1 succulent. We got another succulent. And I got a verdigris sticker, which I can put on anything. And then another verdigris sticker that is already on this bag, but now I can use this bag to represent verdigris. So thanks, everyone.